Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours with AvaTax. Today's topic is your shopping cart should speak sales tax. With me today is Jeff Meisner, the marketing person who dreamed up our awesome title for today's event.
Thank you, Ted.
Jeff, welcome. We also have a special guest, Steve Walsh, who's just recently gone through Avalara's internship program. Last year you joined the CUP team, right?
I did.
Or was it longer than a year ago? I have a terrible sense of time.
I joined in November. Yeah, got hired on full time in January.
Okay, so getting close to a year then.
Yeah.
Awesome. How are we doing by you so far?
Love it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, hey, so we've been doing a lot of fun stuff on this topic for various definitions of fun. Obviously, not everyone likes sales tax as much as I do, but today's topic is just about shopping carts. And I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about what it is that makes a shopping cart work. And it seems like Avalara's customers are kind of divided between those people who are using our tax software for their accounting systems and those people that are using our tax software for, e-commerce, like selling things on the internet. I think I happen to talk to more people who are building shopping carts, but I know that we have a large volume of customers doing accounting systems as well, right, Wayne?
Absolutely. Everything from Great Plains, Sage. Those are the big ones that seem to jump out in my head.
Well, I know we have lots of them. I know we have somewhere around 600 different integrations at this point, and Wayne here is on the developer relations team, so he talks to a lot of people that are working on integrations and working on projects. But what we really wanted to do is let's put a vision out here. So I had to come up with something because Jeff came up with a great topic. I had to come up with like an actual definition of what speaking sales tax means. So, what I'm trying to put out here is I want a shopping cart to actually be useful at the same time that it gives, accurate results. And, speaking as a web designer, Steve, useful is almost always performant, right?
This is true.
So, what do you spend all of your time doing when you're performance tuning for a website?
Converting functions over to be more performant, reducing our big O, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I find a lot of times it's even the really simple stuff. It's like, hey, somebody put a database call in the middle of this. Why would somebody put a database call in the middle of this?
Yeah, it's also definitely controlling the number of AJAX calls and, when we can load DOM content, versus can we make an AJAX call after we load the DOM content, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so obviously there's sensible times to do that, and there's times when it's not particularly useful. So let's go ahead and just pop in. I took a screenshot of a popular internet e-commerce company, and basically what general experience is of a shopping cart is you pick a product. I think I was looking at a new chair for my home office at the time that I captured this screenshot. And so what you do is you put this in, and they give you this little zip code box. You're like, oh, gee, I guess I could fill in a zip code. Well, then all of a sudden the software fills out a tax and a shipping amount. Oh, gee, I get free shipping, but it fills in tax. And then every time I go in and edit my shopping cart, the page refreshes. Every time I make a change, amounts, add, back and forth, even if I try to change delivery addresses or something, the page reloads. And it's not super great, but that's just basically like how you get your accurate price estimate, right? So really what I'm looking at here is most everyone is really concerned about the recalculating time, because if you're asking Avalara to calculate tax for you, we're doing a portion of that work, and every amount of time that we're like the duration of our tax calls, that's what you have to worry about, right?
Yeah. And I kind of remember there were those days where you always had to reload a page, and it's so much better these days when shopping carts update asynchronously without having to do page reloads.
Yeah, so I'll certainly be talking a little bit about that, and part of what I'm going to do is mention to people a little bit about best practices. But I know you do AvaTax calls, continuously. Like everything in your product is calling AvaTax for detail.
Pretty much.
But you do a lot of them on the server side, right?
We do. So we have our own kind of a proxy API wrapper, so to speak, and that lets us do server-side pagination, which speeds things up. We also do a Redis cache for all the next definitions, because that's like a 3 megabyte payload.
Yeah.
And so that really
because you guys spend a lot of time dealing with the Nexus pages. In fact, I'll have some screenshots of some of your stuff in here.
Nice.
But anyways, like really what we're looking at is like everyone who's building this kind of a shopping cart, they want to deal with the recalculating part. They want to make it as fast as possible, and they want to make it sensible and useful. And I'm just noticing a little flag here on the chat. I'm betting that's you, Jeff, but I want to remind everyone, if you see anything in this webinar that you want to ask questions about, please feel free. We're here to chat. We're here to talk to you about the product. And it's either that or 80s movies, and you don't really want to hear me and Jeff lecture about 80s movies.
2 men enter, 1 man leaves.
Yeah, like today is Seattle. The outdoor air is reminiscent of Mad Max, so I think that's where we're stuck at the moment. And as Jeff says, it's Mad Max before one of the stars went nuts. All right, so let's continue on. Really, what I think of as the key problem for building shopping carts is, the delay of loading the page after you've calculated tax. You have to wait for the tax value to come through correctly. But equally well, like what happens if you give someone an estimate? Well, when you finally charge them tax, it won't match what that estimate was. That makes people unhappy too.
Yeah.
You give them an estimate of $10 tax, and then you charge them $9, well, maybe they'll be happy. But if you give them an estimate of 10 and then charge them 11, well, then maybe they'll be a little bit less inclined to be polite when they call your customer support line. But I think as a manager, the key thing that I worry about is, do I have to assign someone to retest the shopping cart every time my tax rules change? There are people out there who have, shopping carts where you just type in the tax rate, and then the instant you have to go in and add a new rule to like change the processing method for your tax, well, you have to go back and retest the entire shopping cart process. It would be much better if AvaTax could handle that for you, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
And, well, as we see here, I found a great photo of one of those locking shopping carts where they have like a little distance sensor. So clearly that's not the best experience. But anyways, really, everybody has to be mindful of tax calculation latency. You've probably already got 20 or 30 scripts in every single page. You've probably got Google Analytics. You've probably got, Adobe, whatever your company is that you're using to track paths through the site. You're probably loading things like Bootstrap and, a whole bunch of other
front-end frameworks like jQuery package alone is $90K, and still a lot of people are using jQuery on their sites.
Yeah, and then on top of that, most companies have a marketing department that write their own JavaScript payload that does their own tracking and their own campaign verification. So every one of these things is going to add a couple hundreds of milliseconds of latency. So really, what I tell people who are worried about latency is that the key thing here is not adding time. It's making sure to streamline that time so that it doesn't appear as part of the critical path. You don't want it to be a single waterfall flowchart where your page renders from one step to the next. You want it to be running concurrently with something else.
Yeah, and that's one thing that happens when you log into the Cup UI. We load some DOM content, and we have a spinner that kind of informs the user that there is something happening, and that's useful because the user's not informed.
And for those of you who aren't versed in Avalara lingo, I should mention that when you use the word cup, that's the internal Jira project name for the AvaTax website. So we often think of projects in terms of their Jira names. So I work on the calc team, so all of my tickets have calc in front of them. Steve works on the cup team, so all of his Jira tickets have cup in front of them.
Yep.
But, for the outside world, he builds the website that you use day in and day out when you're working with AvaTax.
AvaTax update.
I'm going to say Mike got the coolest internal name, though.
What's that?
DevCon.
DevCon?
You just one letter off of DevCon.
I know, yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Take us to DevCon 2.
All right, was that a Sean Connery Red October sort of thing?
No, it was War Games.
War Games?
One of the
That was
greatest
not
games
McKittrick. That was
one
not.
It is one of the greatest 80s.
It is, but like you got to do a Dabney Coleman, man.
It was the Colonel, right?
Oh, you're talking about the Southern guy?
The Southern guy, yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah, what the heck was this? Barry Corbin. Was
Barry
the
Corbin?
actor,
All right.
Yeah.
Don't
Anyway.
play trivia with this group.
Dabney Coleman is like way underutilized nowadays. I mean,
He is.
sure he's basically like 95 years old at this point, but like I'm sure he could like liven up any film.
He was in Boardwalk Empire. He's pretty good.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I gotta watch
I
that.
love that series.
Yeah.
All right, so enough sidetracking. So can I afford to add another API call? Well, here are some other interesting things. I'd like to just put in front of you. I talk to a variety of customers all the time, and I get some really weird and interesting questions. I had one customer say, what if I don't know what the warehouse is that will ship this product? Because there are some circumstances where origin sourcing can affect your tax calculation. Normally, if you're shipping from one state to the other, you don't even have to think about the origin because it's really only the destination that matters. But in the case of intra-state shipments, there are some instances where origin sourcing affects it. You know, there's other people within Avalara who study tax law who could probably give me a wide variety of these circumstances, but you know, that's something that can affect your tax. So what are you going to do if your tax changes when you select the warehouse? Another question is, what if the product might not ship right away? Near and dear to Jeff's heart, I've been ordering Marvel collections of graphic novels. I've been ordering classic Fantastic Four. And recently I ordered a copy of the collection where they meet Galactus. So I ordered it like 3 or 4 months ago, and I just got it like 2 weeks ago. Well, in some instances, companies are allowed to charge their customers when the order is placed. In other instances, the customer is only to be charged when the order ships. You have to talk to your auditor to know which is which. But what happens if File Vault is enabled right in the middle of your presentation? Is that showing up on my screen?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Thank you, IT department. Well, hopefully this isn't a surprise to anyone, but apparently my administrator has enabled File Vault Drive encryption. So make a note of it.
Good to know.
Hey, it's better than Slack popping me up random messages in the middle of a presentation.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Especially when it's, you had a message about a conversation that wasn't necessary.
All right.
Probably.
All right, we're just going to change the topic here before that goes any farther. All right, so a couple other things. Do I need to change my code? Do I need to rewrite my page when my company's tax profile changes? So I've had a couple of companies say, hey, look, I know my business doesn't do sales tax in these 12 states. How about I just speed up my shopping cart by ignoring taxes for those 12 states? Well, that's great, but then what happens if you open up a new field office in one of those 12 states? Well, you're going to have to go back and edit your shopping cart code. So what I encourage people is as much as you can, don't do that. I'll talk more about it in a little bit. It's just, you know, adding hard coding to make things faster just increases risks. I like to design for maintainability. What if my auditor rules that my product category is wrong? Well, auditor rules are pretty wild. Some state auditors have different opinions than other state auditors. I know, shock, surprise, awe. But like I had one customer who sold the exact same product in New York and in the state of Washington. And the auditor in the state of Washington said, I think you have to categorize it as this, which is taxable in my state. The auditor of the state of Washington disagreed and said, no, you can't categorize it as that because that's exempt in New York. You have to categorize it as this, which is taxable. So both states disagreed about how the same product was categorized, and both of them wanted it to be taxable in their state, and both of them refused to accept the other person's categorization. So there's interesting stuff out there. What if an order gets canceled? What if a customer requests a change? Well, you need to know what to do in these circumstances, and you need to know what sort of tax to charge and whether to offer the customer a refund. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those. But let's actually spend the majority of this conversation here talking about actual solutions to these problems, because I think it's a lot less fun than hearing us gripe. You know, we know these problems exist. Avalara was built to make the solutions easy. So we want to talk to you about, like, what can we do? How can we help? You know, maybe you have opinions on this one, Steve, but like, essentially, I look at this as when I'm in a shopping cart, I'm going to send a request to the server for a change to my shopping cart. Server is going to recalculate subtotals. It's going to contact the tax engine. Then it's going to take a rendered page and send it back. And all of these things are basically latency in your page load. So if you do things the simplest possible way, you're going to have, a fair amount of customer experience of waiting. I think one of the geniuses of Amazon was that they had every single thing on that shopping cart page. You could just make the changes directly in it, right?
Oh yeah, that was a fantastic improvement to online shopping carts when you didn't have to reload a page every time you made the smallest change. Something like a quantity update.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to reload the page for that. Wait a second or a second and a half. I think another big improvement is that we have pages that are rendering on the client side.
Mm-hmm.
So as opposed to the server having to re-render an entire page and send the whole thing back to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so really what we're looking at here is I know that it may be very straightforward to do it that way, but let's talk about some basic optimization. So if you have a traditional sequence diagram, if your web browser contacts your web server contacts the AvaTax API, well, I can tell you that the average shopping cart with like 1 to 5 items in it, AvaTax is going to get you an answer in about 60 to 70 milliseconds. Now, that 60 to 70 milliseconds is going to be affected by the number of custom rules you have, a couple of your configuration options, but in general, a small shopping cart should be able to calculate quickly. Now, 60 to 70 milliseconds, well, what happens if you've got really long latency? Let's say we can add another 100 milliseconds between your server and our server.
Sure, that's a fair number.
I don't think it's a great number, but like I talk to people all around the world. There are some people who have data centers in all different parts of the United States, in Europe, in Asia, and there's a limiting factor. The speed of light can't get much faster than I think 40 milliseconds coast to coast.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah, I always tell people when this is a sidetrack, but satellites that are geosynchronous satellites up at 22,500 miles, that's a long time. Speed of light only goes so fast.
Yeah, and part of what I'll tell you is for any reasonably small shopping cart, if I'm ordering like 3 copies of Fantastic Four, graphic novels, well, any small shopping cart, the time that AvaTax takes to calculate tax is going to be dominated, like completely overtaken by the latency between my server and yours. And then the final part of that is that there's also server-side processing. So once I give you the result, you have to parse it. Right. And parsing is not always free. In some cases, it's very fast, but it's not always free. I know you write mostly in JavaScript, so maybe this is not even visible to you, really. You don't even parse it until you start querying the object, right?
Rephrase for me, if you would.
Rephrase. Okay, so when you get a response from the server, you don't have to parse it into an object. It's just in memory as an object.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, it gets parsed from JSON to an object. That happens.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
so I wasn't sure if there was an actual official moment when that happened. So in C# you have to explicitly state, I'm getting a stream of bytes from the server, and I'm going to convert that into an in-memory object.
I see. No, JavaScript pretty much handles that for you, and most of the fetch tools that you can use to make AJAX calls are going to give you an actual JavaScript object. Yeah.
So part of what I can say is that like C# has a very well optimized framework, and I've seen it take about 1 to 2 milliseconds to parse a really large object. So really 1 to 2 milliseconds is something. But if you have a not optimized parser, I've seen customers who had 200, 300 milliseconds latency for a bad parser.
Wow.
It's definitely not fun, and I definitely don't want to recommend it. So really, in this particular scenario, in this particular sequence diagram, you've got the challenge that your entire process is waiting on AvaTax. Everything is put on hold while AvaTax calculates it. So if you've got 50 milliseconds on the server side, if you've got 70 milliseconds on the server side, if you've got 100 milliseconds network latency, if you've got 200 milliseconds network latency, every one of those milliseconds is holding the customer back. Yeah. So really what we're trying to do is to say, let's find a way to do this without holding the customer. Because the other final thing is, what happens if there's a connectivity issue? I mean, you encounter this from time to time, and we're on the exact same network, right?
Right, yeah, and you know, we have to pop up an error screen for the customer. But error handling is also important, so that say we're not getting an answer back. You know, maybe we can re-render that page and say, hey, there was an error in this call.
Yeah.
And we can actually display the page as opposed to putting it in some waiting state while the user doesn't know what's happening.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know that I have a good slide in this presentation deck for error handling, but that's actually a key point. We spend a lot of time and effort documenting our error messages, and I think I've actually got a ticket somewhere in our queue for us to clean up our error messages, right, Wayne?
Yes, we do.
You know, we have to do this every year or so, just go back and look at them and say, can they be better? Because we try our best to make these error messages really useful and relevant. You know, we have connectivity issues sometimes where people are saying, wait a minute, I can't contact AvaTax. Turns out the backhoe cut the network cable in their front yard. You know, this was a pretty nightmarish problem. The customer couldn't do any tax calculation at all, and it turned out that their office complex had cut one of their network cables.
Wow.
So very frustrating. So part of what we're looking at here is how can we make your process work even without that? You know, a better model is I think the one that you were describing here, which is where you render your page with a placeholder. Just put in a placeholder or a spinning indicator or something,
yeah.
And then you set up a stub function. So I think this is kind of what you were describing for your proxy, right? So you call it a proxy, but it's basically like a stub function on the customer's web server, right?
You know, it kind of depends on your framework.
Okay.
Yeah. So with the AvaTax update site, we use an API wrapper. It wraps the REST v2 API, you know, our flagship API, and we can send some calls to that may have some cache data. It'll reduce the size of certain AJAX calls for us.
Yeah, I think reducing the data size is actually very critical here. So one of the things that I would determine is, you know, Avalara returns a lot of information in a tax result. You might only need a certain number of fields. You might only need the total amount or a line-by-line breakdown, or you might want a summary. But like what you should do here in this portion of the stub is filter the results down to the smallest amount that solves your problem.
Right.
Because every byte that you send over the network is also latency.
Yeah, especially as we start talking about scaling a project up where that can really start to add up those delays. You know, for instance, you might not need to know where each jurisdiction's rates are. You know, certainly your user doesn't need to see that. The user's primarily concerned with, well, what's the total tax amount? So, you know, your stub could filter out that data before actually presenting it to the client of the browser.
And what's really fascinating to me is I used to try to slim down the results and return fewer and fewer objects. I've talked to so many customers out there, everybody needs something. So we have some customers that parse the exact detailed results and, you know, save those you know, details out so that they can compare them to their final tax payments. Yeah, there's a whole lot of really interesting stuff there, but definitely what I encourage you to do is have a single purpose stub function. So let's spend a little bit of time just talking about how this works. You know, I definitely recommend, you know, this is a nice little Creative Commons licensed shopping cart image. It's actually very cute. There's cupcakes. My daughter makes cupcakes.
Nice. And I know we mentioned the cup team earlier, but we're obsessed with all things related to cupcakes or orange cups.
Are you trying to ask me for a favor in return for attending this webinar today?
You know, I'll take cupcakes.
You'll take cupcakes. All right. Jeff, you're bankrolling this thing. What do you say?
I'm not bankrolling anybody else's cupcake habit. I have my own problem with cupcake habit.
Well,
you get in on this.
Getting on this. Okay, so basically what we're talking about here is create a very simple HTML element, you know, maybe this total box here, give it a name tag. We're going to work with that HTML element directly. And we're going to add a spinning update icon so that when you load the page, you get something like this. You know, you've got a total, you're going to then hit the stub function. So the point of this is you can render the page immediately.
Correct.
You don't have to wait for anything. You give the customer their results, and hey, they see here's my total, and that total is just calculated without the sales tax. Display the spinning progress indicator. The spinning progress indicator will just tell them, hey, look, this update is happening. Customer at that point can go back and they can edit the quantity amounts, they can remove line items, and every time that happens, you cancel the current stub call and you start another one, right?
That's right. And from a user experience perspective, spinners are useful for informing the user that something's happening.
Mm-hmm.
There's a other side of that coin where spinners can be annoying when they don't go away, but it's fairly easy for a developer to flip that on while we're waiting for an asynchronous call to come back from the server. So that's, from a technical perspective, a really easy thing to do to help out your user.
Gotcha. So yeah, what we've got then is we've got spinning progress indicator, and when the call completes, you update the element and you fill out the HTML from within it with the tax amount and the total amount and whatever else is happening. So really what you've got here is you've got an asynchronous call that's always in flight. Every time the customer makes a change, you cancel the current in-flight AJAX call to the stub function, and then you replace it with a new one.
Right.
And part of what that means is that, we are a highly available company. Our team invests a ridiculous amount of money in making sure that AvaTax is always available, always online, always responsive. Well, you know what? A 1 in a million occurrence when you're Avalara's size happens pretty often. So every once in a while, there are network routing issues or there are backbone challenges, and sometimes a call gets lost or a packet gets lost or something gets delayed. Just the ability to restart this stub call and reload it, I think, is pretty helpful, because if any one call gets unfortunate, if it gets killed for whatever reason, you can always restart it and ensure that this box refreshes.
Yeah, and I've actually noticed this problem where we're not looking to see how long the call takes. So it's useful for a site to say, okay, if this call takes more than 200 milliseconds, we're just going to cancel and start it over again. Because sometimes you go to a website and it's just not loading, and you hit Command R on your Mac or F5 on your PC, and you just reload the page, and then it just loads instantly. Could be because some important AJAX call got lost.
Yeah, or maybe it's just currently in the TCP retry phase, or maybe it's just stuck waiting in a buffer somewhere. There are all sorts of interesting things that do happen in the internet backbone. And so what we want to mention here is look, Steve mentioned 200 milliseconds. I would suggest that's probably a bit aggressive. Maybe if you set a timeout for 1,000 milliseconds,
sure,
I think that's a reasonable length.
That's more reasonable.
So you set a 1,000 millisecond timeout. If you don't get a response in 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second, cancel the call and hit another. So you can ensure that your shopping cart is always up to date, as with this kind of background call, and you can ensure that your customer is never waiting for it, because they can always go in and remove items and adjust items. Maybe they can change their shipping address, or maybe they can edit their birthday greetings or something, right?
Sure.
So really the next thing that I want to talk about is not just the performance of the shopping cart, but like maintaining the shopping cart itself. Speaking as a person who's been a consultant for a lot of my career, sooner or later, I'm going to get a ton of tickets from the accounting department or the tax department, and those tickets are just going to say, hey, look, we've had 13 products that are reclassified. Please go through the code and change these products. And if I'm lucky, there's a database and I can just edit those products in the database. And if I'm unlucky, well, I have to go in and change the rules so that product A in Georgia is taxed one way, product A taxed in New York is a different way. That's not fun. So AvaTax really is designed to make this easy. And this is where I get to call out to Steve. This is what the AvaTax screen looks like for modifying your locations where you collect tax. So if you've got accountants that are kind of keeping a list of where I'm registered to collect tax, they can manage this list. And this kind of dovetails into the Supreme Court decision that's on everyone's minds right now, which is Wayfair.
Yeah, and so with the Wayfair decision, basically, if you have more than $100,000, that you're selling.
That's the amount that I've heard, yeah.
That you don't have traditional nexus in, that's actual physical presence in that state, whether it's a salesman or a warehouse.
And these things are going to change over time. I mean, maybe the number is 100,000 now, but maybe next month the state is going to cut a deal with you or something and ask you to file even if you've only got less dollar value.
But if you know that you're going to be near that threshold, it's as easy as coming into the AvaTax update dashboard for where you collect tax and checking off additional jurisdictions.
Yeah, so part of what we're looking at here is, do you want to have to go back and edit your shopping cart every time your accountant changes your nexus definitions? You really don't. So what you do is you send your addresses to AvaTax and you tell your accountant, go into this page and change the definitions whenever you want. The next big thing is product definitions. And this is also something where we think that, you know, customers should just send their own product codes. If you've got a product catalog that has 1,000 items, or even if it's only got 3 items, yeah, I know this is a Magic the Gathering thing. I sent my daughter to Magic the Gathering summer camp this year.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. But anyways, you set up your shopping cart, you set up these items in the cart, and then we will figure out what the correct taxability is, what the correct rates are in each different jurisdiction. Some products are exempt in one jurisdiction or taxable in another. Some products are taxed at a luxury rate in one location, or some services are taxed at a service rate. One of the interesting things I love to show people when talking about sales tax complexity is there's a fantastic rate table from, I believe it's Missouri, where they have basically a 10-page PDF that is a gigantic printout of a spreadsheet that lists every product that the state of Missouri recognizes on one side and every jurisdiction on the other. And it's just a gigantic grid that you have to figure out.
That sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, so I mean, rather than do that, why not just go into AvaTax and check the box for Missouri and then tell us what your products are? So we just make that simple.
And I would add on to here, you can drill down into higher levels of complexity if you need to. Most users probably won't need to do that. And so then the system is also, just as easy to use. So we kind of nest the more complex or more advanced features into this user interface so that you can make those changes if you need to.
Okay. Yeah, and I'd like to mention, if any of you guys go in and use the AvaTax website and you file a ticket for a problem, please make sure to mention Steve Walsh on it. He'll be happy to hear from you.
I will.
All right, so like the point here is, we want you to have an easy time of things. With this, like the whole point of Steve doing all of this work is that we want you to be able to hand these screens to your accountant and then just walk away. You have integrated AvaTax, you have integrated our SDK into your product, and then all of a sudden the tax calculation is handled without you having to worry about it, without you having to update it. So in order to celebrate that, I found an incredibly happy or sleepy looking panda, depending upon your perspective.
Happiness levels may vary.
Yeah, exactly. Right, so next couple of things. We're talking about shopping carts. We've spent a lot of time talking about performance. We still want to do everything we can to increase the speed of each API call. I think I've looked at it, and in a number of cases, I've found that there's a 5 to between calculating a sales order. I'm trying to help customers looking at a shopping cart. Don't use a sales invoice. If they're just looking at the shopping cart, call us and use a sales order. Every millisecond matters. Everything we can do to help, really, we want to do what we can. As long as you're tinkering with the shopping cart, you just keep sending sales orders over and over and over again. Only when the user clicks to purchase, that's when you switch to a sales invoice. And a sales invoice is actually recorded, and we keep track of it, and we have the option of filing tax for you if you decide to use Avalara's managed tax returns business. So this is where we get into retries. Like, do you have a policy of number of retries that you do for an API call?
It depends. It depends. Yeah, there's it really depends on the page and what kind of data we're trying to pull back. I'm trying to think of a specific example.
Yeah.
But
I can think of one example, which is there was one customer that I was working with who was really trying to do their best to make their payment process reliable. And what they determined was for them, for the size of their orders and for the position of their data center and for their code, they chose to make a 2,000 millisecond timeout for a tax calculation. So that was what was appropriate for them. But then they also specified that they wanted to retry the call twice before they gave up and determined that it failed.
Yeah.
So retrying twice would mean that if they happened to get stuck in transit, or if there was a TCP/IP delay, or if there was any kind of issue between their server and AvaTax, they would give it a second try, closing the connection, opening a new one, and very good chance that second call would not suffer from the same random failure.
Yeah, I like that too. Also from a user experience perspective, because again, I keep making comments based on your user experience, but that's primarily what my job is focused on, is making a really good UI. So informing the user of what's happening is important, because when there's user frustration, when it looks like a page just isn't loading, the site just isn't working, the customer's losing confidence in you, the user might go someplace else.
Yeah. And it's worth thinking about this. Pick your timeout, pick your retry count. So I knew one customer who they had a third party build their integration. And that third party said, we're going to put a 3 retry on everything. So every API call, they would retry 3 times. The integration company, however, did not set the timeout value. So the default timeout value in their programming language was 30 seconds.
Ooh.
So all of a sudden, when a problem happened with the network, you would have a 30-second freeze where the application was completely non-responsive for 30 seconds. Then it would retry, there'd be another 30 seconds. Then it would retry again, there would be a third 30 seconds. And then it would go back to the accounting system. Well, you know what the accounting system did at that point? It had a 3 retry policy itself.
Oh my goodness.
So basically, every single time anything happened, their UI was frozen for about 5 minutes. And it was astonishing, but you have to choose your timeouts, you have to choose your thresholds. Don't just pick defaults. This is actually something that Wayne and I are talking about, really calling out in the SDKs. We want to make all of our AvaTax software development kits give you guidance and give you tools on what your expected timeouts are. But then again, to what you said earlier, Steve, different circumstances may differ. You may want to have different timeouts for create transaction versus listing companies.
Right, because that listing companies is you'd expect that to be a very fast return call. Yeah.
All right. Well, anyways, let's keep this going. I want to make sure that I reserve a little bit of time at the end of this presentation for Q&A. So, Jeff, please speak up if you get any questions on this.
Will do.
Next thing I want to mention is credit card settlements. This is actually something that doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think it's really valuable. The story here is that if you are one of those customers who doesn't know where your product will ship from, if you don't know exactly which day it will ship, sometimes a matter of one day in difference will change your tax calculation. Sometimes a change in the location of shipping address of warehouse can make a big difference. What we're really talking about here is if you know that there's likely to be a transaction affecting change between when the customer asks for the purchase and when you actually finalize the purchase, let's suggest that you should consider using credit card settlement. So the way that works is that you first of all calculate tax and authorize the transaction. So when you authorize the transaction, you authorize an appropriate amount based upon your contract with your credit card provider, and you say, hey, this transaction is going to finalize in X number of days. Well, some credit card settlement companies will expect things to finalize within a short period of time. Some of them can be held open for longer. you'll have to talk to your credit card company. But if you are able to do this, it would be a huge help, because then if you ship it from California or if you ship it from Tennessee, you'll be able to recalculate tax before you ship.
And there's other considerations for this too, beyond tax, is that, you may or may not want to be recognizing revenue when you invoice. You're recognizing revenue before something ships. So that's another consideration there.
Yeah, totally. I know that, previously I worked in the video game industry, and we couldn't recognize revenue until the actual pallets of boxed software shipped out of the warehouse factory door.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That goes to show how old I am. I don't really that many boxes are sold nowadays, but I'm sure some of them are. So talk to your credit card provider, see if credit card settlement would help you. If you do that, that means that you can calculate the exact correct tax for when the product ships. All right, I should also call out here, this little line right here, only committed transactions will be reported. Are you familiar with committing?
I am. So
almost as if we taught you something.
I hope so. So before you commit a transaction, you can touch it as many times as you want, but once you commit it, or once you void it, you can't touch it anymore.
Yeah, so the good news is I put together this handy little flow chart a while ago.
I use this chart on a somewhat regular basis.
Awesome.
To remind myself.
Actually, like this was one of the first things that I had to research when I was working on AvaTax, was nobody had actually drawn this before. But really what we've got is once you create a transaction, you can choose to create it in a saved state or a committed state. And the difference between those two is that committed means it's ready to be filed on a tax return. Saved means we're not ready yet. So I know some companies have multi-stage workflows. Maybe every single order has to go to Bob in the factory, and the factory needs to verify that they've got the products on hand. Then it's got to go to Alice in accounting, who verifies that this is a customer in good standing. Then it's got to go to, you get the idea. It's got to go through all of these different stages of approval. So what you might want to do is match saved to ready for Bob, and you might want to match posted to ready for Alice. And then committed would mean everybody's signed off on it.
Yeah.
So you could choose to do that. You could choose to set up your workflow in AvaTax. This is totally optional. A lot of people who do e-commerce shopping carts will do the simplest possible solution.
Go straight to committed, yeah.
Yeah, basically, when you're viewing the shopping cart, you use sales orders. It's never saved. There's no risk of accidentally paying tax on something that somebody saw in a shopping cart. But then the instant somebody clicks to place an order, you call commit, and you commit the transaction. So that's the simple choice, is just shopping carts are sales orders, and final purchases are sales invoices with commit equals to true.
But what you were getting at with these potential timing delays, or maybe there's a couple days between when we're actually going to ship the product from when they bought it on the website, on the shopping cart, maybe that time period is over the boundary of a quarter, and oftentimes states are updating tax rates quarterly.
Yes.
So you could run into a potential issue there. So if you're saving this transaction, you could potentially make changes to it before committing it.
And also good for saving things is file vault enabled. So I'm going to go ahead and. All right.
They really want to make sure you know.
They really do. I'll be sure to tell the security team that they had a guest spot in my presentation today. So anyways, final item that's worth mentioning is just because it's committed doesn't mean you can't make changes. However, if you have reported that transaction to a tax authority, you can no longer make changes. There's simply no possibility. Once you've reported it on a tax filing, that's it. It's finished. It's audit necessary. There are laws that mean you can't change the transaction. So very briefly, the one thing that I did not have when I drew this original chart is that if you have a locked transaction that's been filed on a tax return, the way to reverse it is to call refund transaction. And what we will do is we will create a net opposite transaction that is the exact inverse of it. So the two of them together will net out to zero.
Will that span reporting periods?
That will work correctly based upon each tax authority's rules for reporting periods. Some tax authorities insist that it get reported one way, some tax authorities, but if you use the refund transaction API on a locked transaction, our returns team will guarantee to file it correctly.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I like guarantees.
Yes. So anyways, moving on. Couple of things to help you. And then I know we want to, I can see you flagging me down, Jeff. We've got about 15 minutes left. I want to cover
a couple of questions, yeah.
I just want to cover a couple of things first, and then we can go to the Q&A part. So our developer relations team, led by Wayne here, is really eager to help everyone make use of AvaTax. So part of what we do is we publish the software development kits. And Wayne, I know this is something we're actively working on, is updating all of our SDKs to the various languages, right?
Yes, we have SDKs in Ruby, C#, JavaScript, PHP, Java. I'm a little partial to Java. That's the one I personally maintain. And we try to keep those released in lockstep with the REST API.
Emphasis on try to. I know right now we've had a lot of people on summer holidays, so I think we're a little bit behind at the moment. But let me just give you a quick walkthrough of how to add this. If you go into your product, this is you know, any integrated development environment, just search for AvaTax. You should be able to find our SDK, and you should be able to see, you know, in this one, I have my name on it, so you can see that it's the correct Avalara one. We've got our logo there. And if you use our SDK, one of the key benefits that we like to tout is that you get context-sensitive help in your IDE. Last I heard, Steve, you guys still don't use the JavaScript SDK, right?
We do not.
You know, in all fairness, that's because you guys started your product before the SDK was available. You know,
that gives some background context.
I can only hassle you so much for that. You know, it's kind of like asking why the people in the Civil War didn't use Jeeps. You know.
Yeah, yeah. However, we so that customers know, we're actually just hitting all the same AvaTax endpoints that any other integration would. So we're using the same tools are available to us for the most part. I mean, 99% of the cases that they are to customers.
Yep, and this is a big thing for us. We used to have a whole bunch of hidden APIs that would be only available to one team. Well, we put a stop to that. Everything that Avalara does is fully out there. It's fully documented on the developer site. And Wayne and I write and update and refine documentation every single month. And we're always looking to improve this. Every time Steve's team sends me something, we improve the documentation, and that same documentation goes both to him and to all of our customers out there. So if you're looking to integrate sales tax into your shopping cart, we can assure you that we're doing our best to make the documentation useful. Developer sites. Wayne, like, do you want to give a pitch on the developer site?
We're pretty proud of developer.avalara.com. This is the documentation that's generated off of the REST API. There is a developer guide that
lays out. I got a screenshot of that. There we go.
Lays out common use cases and problems, troubleshooting. And soon there will actually be a quick start guide that will be available through the developer guide. The minimum you need to get up and running within a couple minutes with using AvaTax. On developer.avalara, for the API reference, there are try now features on pretty much every page for the methods in our API. So you don't even need to sign up. You just go straight in and you can play with the API with a fully functioning account.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize that there's two different sides to documentation. One side is what is the API and how does it work? That's like the reference material where we explain each API and we explain each parameter. But then the other part is like, what's the theory behind it? Why are we even doing this? Why do we even ask you to call this API in the first place? That's what the developer guide is.
That's a great point, Ted. One of the first things I did when I came to Avalara is I actually signed up for a trial account, and I downloaded the Postman collection off of the developer.avalara.com site, and I went through the developer guide step by step, and it taught me the basics of the API, and it, you know, didn't take me that long to do, and I learned a lot in that process. So if you're a developer that's looking at making an integration, this might be a good place to start to give yourself some background and context.
Yeah, and then of course, you know, we really just want to keep plugging this. Use an SDK. There's no reason that everybody has to write their own like REST API call functions. We just put all of this stuff into a single shared library, and you know, we test it on our side so it'll work on yours. Finally, I do also want to call out to the Partner Launch team. Jeff Meisner and I work pretty closely with Partner Launch, and they are a little bit different from the developer team. So the key thing about the developer team is that developer team is focused on people who are writing their own code. The Partner Launch team is focused on like helping businesses partner with Avalara. So rather than just, you know, getting something done for your shopping cart, this is the team that helps big e-commerce companies include Avalara tax calculation in their platform. So if you're thinking about building a marketplace, if you're thinking about building the next great e-commerce online bazaar to compete with all of the big names out there, Avalara would be happy to partner with you and make sure that all of your integrations have accurate tax calculation everywhere. So this team is available, and they'll talk to you, and they'll come up with ways to bring all of the people in your marketplace into the Avalara world, get the correct tax amounts, and then we'll also work with you on the compliance for the complex laws like the Washington Marketplace Act. That's the law that says that within the state of Washington, a marketplace that sells products for many individual companies must collect and remit tax on behalf of those companies. So that part's pretty tricky, and we have teams to help you negotiate that. They also have a really awesome logo, which is a little hamster with a hard hat on. I suppose you could also look at it like a Viking hamster, which is what I first glimpse nowadays when I see it, like Viking horns on the helmet. I know that's technically a myth. I know that they don't actually have horns on their helmets, but like, you know, it's stereotypes. So what are you gonna do?
What are you gonna do?
Kind of looks like that character from Adventure Time.
Really? I was thinking like Tom Cruise Mission Impossible. Yeah, could be. Yeah. Well, anyway, so we have lots of teams to help you, and I did actually get to the end here. Jeff, do you have any questions?
We have a couple of questions, yeah. The first one is, what do I need to do to set up my items?
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to pop out of this presentation right here. I'm going to load up Steve's favorite user experience.
Okay.
So let's go over to, all right, admin.avalara.com. Oh, it's not going to remember my password. Oh, my goodness. Give me just a sec to get this, but Steve, you want to like do a song and dance while I type in my password here?
Yeah, so AvaTax Update is a user interface for your AvaTax configuration. You can see all of your, you can edit all of your configurations, all your settings, which products you sell, where you collect tax. You can view your transactions. We have some additional features like returns and customer exemptions. Yeah, we integrate with another product that we offer called Cert Capture, and so you can track your customer certificates for when you should not be charging tax.
So this is the screen you wanted me to load, right?
Correct.
Okay. So if you want to set up your items here, first thing to note is any item code you send to AvaTax will be treated as tangible personal property if you don't create an item code here.
Yeah.
So if you send us a completely random code, like any random string of ones and zeros and numbers and letters, as long as you've got only 3 items here, everything other than that will process correctly, will just get treated like tangible personal property. Tangible personal property is the general tax accountant's term for something that is a physical good that you can sell. But let's say, I don't know, give me something we're going to sell.
We're going to sell baseballs.
Baseballs, all right. So I'm going to add an item for baseballs. Let's call it baseball 1, 2, 3. So I've got a whole bunch of different baseballs, and this baseball is product code 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Well, this is going to be a baseball novelty with funny signatures. So let's say this is a baseball with like the signatures from all the people from Abbott and Costello's who's on first thing.
Oh,
so just weird, silly thing. Well, how do you then figure this out? Well, you can look in here and you can type baseball. Gloves. All right. Well, maybe I'm selling a baseball glove. So, baseball novelty glove, funny signatures, there's my tax code. So, if my shopping cart sends the code baseball glove before I've done this, it will just get treated like TPP, and usually that will give you a pretty good tax result. But then your accountant can come in and change this item code anytime they want and change it to PCO 40403. And that will give customized tax treatment in those jurisdictions where those things are treated differently.
Mm-hmm.
Make sense?
That makes sense.
Jeff, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I believe so.
Do we have more on the line?
Yes. Let's see. I still need address validation in my shopping cart. Can I use Avalara for address validation?
Okay, so address validation in your shopping cart. Address validation is kind of interesting because Avalara has specific laws around what we have to do for address validation. A lot of you, when you validate an address, what you're going to do is you're going to open up your favorite search engine or your favorite map engine. You're going to type in the address into Google or Bing or MapQuest or whatever it is out there, OpenStreetMaps. But basically, Avalara has legal requirements that we have to use the United States Postal Service's address validation API. We have to use this because we need to be able to tie to exact address that have been certified by a governmental entity. So when you call AvaTax, what we're doing is we're using this USPS validation logic, and that means that there are some new construction areas or some addresses that may not show up in AvaTax for a short period of time. So
and sometimes there are caveats to some addresses are never going to be able to be validated by USPS.
But the other thing is, on the other interesting side, is that there are some addresses that don't technically exist. There's interesting things like general delivery. General delivery is a USPS code for we'll hold it at the post office and hand it to you when you want to pick it up. There's another interesting thing, which is that there's some synthetic postal codes that don't technically exist that have been assigned to specific companies. There's one company in Florida that obtained their own postal code. There is no actual latitude and longitude associated with this postal code. But if you type in the postal code correctly, AvaTax will handle it correctly as going to that company and getting the tax treatment for that company.
Wow, that's fantastic. So we really, when we were developing that, really got down to these details, huh?
Yeah, and part of what we do is we've got this resolve address API for you. So if we go in here and we fill in a sample address, 2000 Main Street, Irvine, California, happens to be one of my favorite little, office plazas in Irvine. You may have heard me say it before, but the Taco Bell corporate tasting kitchen used to be there.
Oh.
I've actually had lunch at the Taco Bell corporate tasting kitchen. It was pretty cool. But anyway,
how does that compare to a typical Taco Bell restaurant?
Much better because they're usually experimenting on the things they're going to send to the stores later.
I see.
So this API call, you can give us an address, and we'll do our best to validate it. So in this particular case, we said, hey, it's a street or residential address. Here's the full address. Hey, look, we gave you the zip +4. We gave you the latitude and longitude. On the other hand, what happens if I use a fake address? 123 Main Street. Well, I happen to know that Main Street starts at 1000. Well, unknown address type. We're going to guess that since you're meaning Irvine, California, we're going to guess this is pretty close, but we'll tell you that we were not able to actually code this, and we give you an error message saying that this address number is out of range, because the lowest address on Main Street in Irvine is 1000. So this is basically how address validation works. Now, you don't necessarily need to use Avalara's address validation in your shopping cart. It's available for you if you want it, but you have to recognize that there's USPS validation going on here that you may not need if you really just want like Google address validation. So just keep that in mind.
Why should you use Avalara's address validation?
If you want to guarantee that it is definitely deliverable by the United States Postal Service, you would use our API. If you actually have a rule from your auditor that you have to use the USPS address validation, if you're using the Streamlined Sales Tax Governing Board's rules, and oh boy, look at that, it's 11 o'clock. I don't have to talk about all the rest of the use cases. So anyways, the point is that there are use cases where people need that actual governmental level of accuracy, and that's what our software is here for. So Steve, I just want to say thank you very much for attending. It's always fun to chat with you.
I was really glad to be here.
For fun, Steve also helped to develop a lot of the code for the developer site, so Wayne and I owe him a big debt. And thank you, as always, Jeff, for facilitating this. We'll see you back for the next webinar in September.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.